Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. Joining us today is New York Times bestselling author Dr. Dambisa Moyo and Jerusha Stewart, CEO of Take Your Seat. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Moyo, co-principal of Versaka Investments, a family office focused on growth investing globally. She serves on a number of global corporate boards, including 3M Corporation, Chevron, and Condé Nast. Dr. Moyo is a preeminent thinker who influences key decision makers in strategic investment and public policy, and was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. Dr. Moyo is the author of 4 New York Times bestselling books, and in addition, How Boards Work and how they can work better in a chaotic world. Along with Dr. Moyo, please welcome Jerusha Stewart, a visionary do-gooder. Jerusha is the CEO and co-founder of TakeYourSeat.co, the nation's premier online platform committed to helping candidates and boards achieve boardroom diversity success in the near term for the long term. Take Your Seat is a robust community aiming to close the networking gap while building inclusive boards of the future. It's an honor to have 2 powerful women with us today for a conversation about the future of America's boards. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome, welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
There we go. Hello.
Hello. Well, hello, Dr. Moyo. It is thrilling to be with you here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Your book is a fascinating read. Your history of board service has encompassed serving on boards in the United States as well as Great Britain. And during that career, you experienced such chaotic times, like the time the chairman of the board died, or you were navigating the sale of a $100 billion global corporation, or let's talk about the expropriation of company assets by a host government, and really the massive restructuring of a company's business model due to share price collapse. That's all in the first chapter. I want to know, what motivated you to put this all down in black and white?
So first of all, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to engage not just with you, Jerusha, but with also the broader audience on, really the important role that corporations play in the global economy and in society and in our communities, but also to really explain, but also engage in a conversation about what the role of the corporate board and indeed corporate governance more generally, whether it's a school governance committee, a trustee of a museum, the heads of governance of an NGO, what that role is and how that role is rapidly changing in a complex world. Your question is a brilliant one. Why did I write this book? This is my 5th book, and to be honest, my first 4 books were books that were focused on my PhD, and in my background is working on Wall Street. In that respect, we're very focused on the macroeconomy and geopolitics. I've written this book really because people were pushing me to write a memoir about the arc of my life, having been raised and born in Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world, and finding myself serving on the boards of large global and complex organizations across the developed world. But it's not my interest at all to write a book, a memoir, and I kind of felt I was too young anyway, even if I wanted to. I'm only 52. I think I have a bit more tires to get burned here. But I did want to really explain, the sort of aspects around my own unconventional board career. And I felt it was an important time to, as I say, reassert the important role that corporations play, given a time when there's a lot of skepticism about companies, about capitalism, and the world is changing in such a manifestly positive but also negative ways. So that was really the backdrop, and I feel like this is a good marriage of content, I hope, but also that sort of memoir aspect that my agent and publisher were pushing me in the direction they're pushing me into, because it does draw on my own experience being on boards for the past over a decade now.
Yes, it's an incredible perspective, sort of like an insider fly on the wall in a boardroom, which many of us would like to attain that seat in the boardroom. So first, I want to you talk about how boards are so complex today, but let's start at the beginning. You had a fascinating discussion in your book on the history of boards. And I don't think that most people realize, why do we have boards?
Yeah, so the earliest evidence of boards that I could find dates back to the 1600s. I mean, if you take a moment to think about that, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I've actually served on a company that's been around for 360 years, and they've had a board, since then. The original board that I referred to in the book, and I talk a lot about how that was set in place, was really the Bank of England, and how around that structure they had at that time anywhere from 12 to 24 directors, and their responsibility, actually, if you think about it, hasn't materially changed over the centuries. In that respect, they're still responsible for strategy. They're still responsible for hiring, and in some instances, firing the chief executive. But as I know we're going to get into, that role is changing rapidly, and there are now other aspects that have been attached to the mandate. But if you think about what has happened to corporations since the 1600s, it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, they would have gone through World War I and World War II, the Spanish flu, the industrialization, a period where China was the largest and most important economy in the world, through colonialization, and to a world where we've seen enormous globalization just in the last 50 years, the advent of technology, et cetera, et cetera. And so being a custodian, being on the board, and therefore a custodian with a fiduciary duty to manage these businesses through these challenging times, I think is a critically important story to narrate, because I do worry a lot that we live in a world where people think that the answer is obvious, and I can assure you it never is. These issues that we're dealing with, whether it's strategy, hiring, or indeed the cultural frontier, these areas are very complex and ever evolving in a very fast and rapid pace.
Yes, and one of the things I found really interesting that you spoke about in the book is the idea that with all of this complexity, the boards are making their decisions with imperfect information. That's
our job? That is our job. I cite in the book something that President Obama said, which I really love. He talked about how when he was president, by the time something ended up in his mailbox or in his inbox, it meant it was extremely difficult, because if it were easy, somebody else would have solved it. And the board agenda is exactly the same. By the time something is on the boardroom agenda, it means it's extremely complicated. If it were easy, someone else would have solved it. And so as we think about the role of boards, and we think about the challenging environment in which boards serve, it's not just about the fact that we have imperfect information and concerns that I address about asymmetry of information between the board and the management. It's also about the fact that, January last year, we were having great conversations about a strong economy that we had, and no one had any expectation that all of a sudden we would be dealing with an emergency of the scale of the breadth and width of COVID-19. And that's just one example. I mean, since I joined the board, we've had a financial crisis, we've had the Greek debt issue, we've had populism rise up, the increasing role of China. So, a friend of mine who actually served on a board with me, he's in his 80s, and I just had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, Dambisa, I'm in my 80s. There's one thing I can assure you, that you will never be able to anticipate what happens next. And in his 80-year life, he's talked about how we should always expect to be surprised. And I think that the role of boards and good board members is to understand that very fundamentally, and to make sure that we're overseeing structures and organizations that are flexible enough to sort of ebb and flow with the changes that come, whether they're macroeconomic, geopolitical, social, cultural, etc.
So as a board member in this ecosystem, what feeds you? What has you want to sit at that table and endure all of this?
So I love puzzles. And I think anybody who likes to sort of a neat box with one answer should not go into the boardroom. That is not the place for you. Boards are, well, certainly myself, I speak for myself, I'm constantly intrigued by questions, things that, perhaps on the surface look obvious, but actually are much more complicated. They're often second order effects that we tend to breeze over. And we'll get into some examples of this, I'm sure. There's a whole list of this in the cultural frontier. Things like climate change. A lot of people think it's clear cut, it's obvious. We have an urgent and an important risk that's coming down. We should defund the energy companies. Well, that kind of an attitude doesn't really take into consideration the fact that there are about 1.5 billion people around the world who've got no access to energy and living in energy poverty with no access to energy in a sustainable, cost-effective, and scalable way. Racial diversity, which I know is very important to both of us and then to others on the call. Yes, on the surface of it, and in fact, not even just the surface, look at the data. And I point a lot of data that has been, analyzed from Harvard and McKinsey and other great names. There's no doubt about it that companies and organizations that are more diverse, whether it's racially, gender, or other backgrounds, they do better. It's not just about survival, it's about thriving, it's about competitiveness. If you want to not just survive, but compete, you're going to have to be diverse. You should be diverse at the board level, should be diverse at the management level, and broadly in the workforce. But, we want to make sure that that kind of a narrative doesn't exclude high-performing white guys. And so, once again, from the board, I'm interested in making sure that the companies that I serve on and other companies in the ecosystem are going to thrive for the next 300 years. And that responsibility means seeing through very often a lot of things that in the here and now look very easy and, we should just do this. Whether it's voting rights, gun control, obesity questions, issues of data privacy, should we invest in China? As I said, racial discrimination. I mean, the list is on, and many of these issues are covered in the book. But all of these are very complicated issues, and we don't want to fight discrimination with discrimination. So again, boards are being asked to sort of thread a very thin needle, remembering also that we are not elected officials. So asking us to opine on public policy and to do public policy in of itself makes it very challenging.
So you may not be elected officials, but you do have a duty to be responsive to the community. Absolutely. And ESG is an ever evolving and a huge agenda at the table for boards. How do you think boards, how are they going to critically assess these issues, and how are they going to evolve to deal with them?
Well, we are evolving constantly. If I think about my past 10 years, just over 10 years of being on boards, I've seen a material change in how we address these issues. When I joined my first board, issues of community, or what we used to call CSR, corporate social responsibility, were kind of ring fenced, and they were over there. And, we thought about them as essentially as an afterthought, or maybe we'd fund a fund run by employees to raise money for the local community, as an example. But then it moved into, well, wait a second, over time, we started to think more about risk. How should the corporation be thinking about risk? Again, let's take the environment as an example. A lot of the discussion started to focus on, greenhouse gas emissions. What about CO2 emissions? What about water intensity, the environment? But I would say that the lens still was very much risk mitigation. And that was another sort of incarnation of how corporations were participating in this broader utility function. We then moved on from that into a world where we said, hang on a second, this shouldn't be some ring-fenced, foundation over there, company X's foundation. This should be part and parcel of how we do business. We ended up with the triple bottom line, if you remember those types of monikers. And more and more, we're now thinking, wait a second, it's not just about risk mitigation, is also about upside. We can't just talk, we're not going to be able to shrink our way to growth and to human progress. We need to think about not just, CO2 emissions, but where should we be investing? Should it be solar, water, wind? Should we be investing in different communities? How should we be investing so that we get the upside as well as downside? And now, as a next step, we're thinking much more, not just about metrics, just everybody loves to throw out, oh, we need more metrics. I think we need to be judicious about how we think about those metrics, because we need to think about the second order implications. But more and more, we're now talking about integrated reporting. So again, it's not this sort of afterthought as we think about climate change or racial discrimination, etc. Those are part and parcel of how we do business on a day-to-day basis. And so, even as I said, just in 10 years, the evolution of the role of corporations on the back of that Business Roundtable 2019 statement has not just been a theory. It's an actual practical living thing that is changing, and in many respects moving even faster than government and regulators in a broader context.
So I want to take a moment to encourage the audience to enter your questions in the chat. As you can see, Dr. Moyo has a lot of opinions on this broad landscape of the boardroom. She has a lot of experience to share. I want to go back to your comments about racial equality in the boardroom and diversity, which both you and I are very passionate about, and ask, are boards doing enough?
Well, to me, there's never such a thing as enough, and I think that we should not get into a false sense of comfort that there's some equilibrium where we'll all wake up and say, oh gosh, that's great, that's enough, there's nothing more to be done. These are living organisms in many respects, these institutions, and they have to evolve. Society is evolving, regulators are evolving, the employee base is evolving, and therefore there is no sort of one point in time to say we're doing enough. Now, I would actually argue, and I talk about in the book, that there are many things, other things that we could be doing. When I was working on Wall Street at places like Goldman Sachs, people were already, 10, 15 years talking about the need to change practices in terms of how we attracted, recruited, promoted people who are of different backgrounds. Clearly, that's not enough. If it were enough, we wouldn't be having the concerns that we've had, certainly in the past year to 18 months. So there's a lot more that companies do. One of the suggestions that I have in the book is talking about how companies, they have a lot of cash and they make decisions about where they are going to host their annual shareholder meetings, where they send their management teams to have discussions, where they have team meetings all across, not just the United States, but across the world. I think that there's a lot more scope for us to say, wait a second, and by the way, I'm giving a free great idea to Moody's and S&P here. I'm sure they won't give me any credit for it if they do it, but they can go and say, well, why don't you rank these countries or these cities and communities that, Tampa versus Tulsa, Oklahoma, tell me in terms of education, in terms of criminal justice, in terms of healthcare, what are your metrics? And we're only going to host a conference there if we think that there's actual real progress going on. So I don't think there's anything wrong with boards or society saying, wait a second, we can do better. We can, clearly we can. Otherwise the numbers wouldn't look the way they are. And what my best friend, Melody Hobson, who's now chairman of Starbucks, always says, the numbers don't lie. And we know that senior management love to respond, and they do respond to clear metrics when numbers are involved. And the numbers are awful at pretty much every level of diversity. And so there's work to be done. I'm optimistic. I'm eternally optimistic. I've seen so many things happen over a short period of time, and so I do believe that there's good momentum here, and we should keep it up. Having said that, I will just put one last thing. From our side as the sort of the minority groups, we should have no illusion that somehow there's an engraved invitation coming to Dambisa Moyo to join some board. The competition is tight. It's tough. It's getting tougher. I like to joke that, maybe 10 years ago, in fact, 10 years ago, I was the only woman and the only person of color on many of the boards I served on. Now, if you want to join the board of Amazon and you open up and you see they've appointed Indra Nooyi, you're like, yeah, Indra Nooyi deserves to be on the board of Amazon. And so you might get an interview based on your race and gender, but people still need competence. The board has a job to do. And so we should not be under any false illusion that somehow that standards should be or are going to be dropped. We're not asking for favors. We're just asking for an equal shot. And I definitely feel that the mood music has changed and it's going to give us that shot. So when the phone call comes, let's just make sure we're ready.
So let's talk about that being ready. When you sat on your first board, you were quite an unconventional choice, right? Yeah. You were Black. You were from Africa, you were 39, you were a woman, and you'd never been near the C-suite.
Correct.
So what set you apart?
Well, context really matters. I had spent the better half of 5 years, probably more, trying to get on boards. And I think it's really important that I say that because I don't want anyone to have the illusion that, oh gosh, she's on these boards, it must have been easy for her. It wasn't, and so it's par for the course. It's tough to get on boards. It just is. There are only 12 seats roughly on many of these corporations. So, don't be discouraged, but also don't, again, be under this falsehood that perhaps, now is our time and therefore it's going to be easy. It's not. I had tried for over half a decade to try and get on boards. Not only did I not get on boards for those first 5 to 7 years, but really nobody was giving me feedback on what exactly the problem was, why I was not getting on boards. What changed really was I published a book, and don't get freaked out. You don't have to write a book in order to get on boards, but it was an opportunity for me to set myself apart from the proverbial pack. But I think more than that, it also helped me streamline my thinking in terms of what actually value I could really add to the corporations that I was interested in joining. And so I think that's a really important thing. People say they want to join boards, but they very often, not all the time, but very often don't even spend the time thinking about what the company's issues are, what specifically are the companies looking for to see if they're a match, and so I think that that's in a really important area of how we approach the board search and trying to put our hands up to say, which by the way we should, hey, I'm interested, but don't be sort of ignorant or naive about the fact that corporations are also, very often it's not just the corporations, the CEO is looking for people who can be a support system, but also provide input and information that would be helpful to the continual success of a business. And so in my case, I had written a book about emerging markets, specifically about underperformance of emerging markets and why, economically they were underperforming because of aid. A lot of the companies, unsurprisingly, that I initially joined were companies that had businesses in the emerging markets. And they found that was an attractive, constructive way of helping them to think through how they could best support not just their businesses, but the emerging market communities in which they work. So that was my specific line, but I do think the broader point still stands that we all need to continually think about what we're adding value on and how we're adding value in a unique way, and how that sets us apart from another candidate who very often now could look like us.
Well, and when we just got a question here in the chat from someone asking about being a Black executive level woman and wanting to know, are there some hurdles that we just don't see in terms of getting on in the boardroom? Because I've got to say, even though we're making progress, these positive irritants that are currently surrounding this conversation, like the California law mandating board diversity, other states following suit, Goldman Sachs and the Carlyle Group, really pressing in on this issue and restricting credit lines and launching of IPOs. I don't know that it's really moving the needle, especially when a recent survey came out of California that saw that 71% of new board seats in California still went to white men. So is there something else we're missing in this conversation?
Look, I think that we shouldn't. I mean, personally, I don't lead with my race and gender. It's obvious that I'm a Black woman. I mean, anyone who looks at me knows that, and I'm very proud to be that. In fact, if anything, I think it's been such a great help to my career. I'm the one who gets remembered if I go to a meeting. Even when I was junior working at Goldman Sachs, if I went to a meeting, I would be the only person who was a different gender, different race. People would remember, oh yeah, maybe they wouldn't remember my name because my name is relatively difficult for them, but they would remember that I was in the room. And so I tend to wear my race and gender as a badge of honor. Now, of course, I'm not so naive as to not understand that there's discrimination and that there are people who will set a bar much higher because of the way I look and the way I speak and my background, etc. But I do think that the way we should lead is not by saying, hey, I would like to join your board, and I think because you don't have enough women or you don't have enough Blacks, I think you should consider me. That's never going to fly. Partly because of what I already said, the competition is so broad. There are the melodies of this world, the Indra Nuis of this world. These are people who are joining these boards, and they should be. They are highly talented people who have shown time and time again over their careers to be judicious, well thought of team players who are always pushing the needle, but also, with a record of phenomenal success. And so as we think about our careers, yes, there's no doubt about it that we're in a world now where your race and or gender might get you an interview, but ultimately it's competence that's going to get you the board seat. Nobody's doing anybody any favors. I still sit on boards as an audit committee member. I have to sign off the regulatory financials at every quarter. They still want to staff the board with people who've got audit and accounting experience, who've got compensation experience, who've got experience around nominations, governance, strategic questions. And so there should be no doubt about the fact that, yeah, the world is a tough place. There's no one said anything differently. But it's only when and as I said to you, Jerusha, a moment ago, when you get that call, make sure that you're ready. Make sure when someone asks you, hey, why are you interested in joining the board of this company, you're not just saying, well, I heard that you don't have a lot of women, or by the way, people have said this to me in board interviews. Well, I understand that you don't have enough diversity. That to me is demeaning for us, because we are actually talented people who can add real value to companies. And it should be in many respects, in the ideal world, it really ought to be immaterial what we look like. I know we're not living in a world where that it isn't immaterial, but this is our opening now. And so it's much more attractive, much more compelling when people say, hey, the reason I'm interested in your board, I just understand that you've just done an acquisition in China, and I was reading an article, and here are the things I'm thinking about in terms of the risks in China. And I think I could be added value in the compensation committee or in the audit committee, and leading with how you can add real value to complex businesses. Someone said to me not too long ago that actually you need at least 3 minorities on a board before it becomes irrelevant. So if you have 1 woman, everybody thinks you're there because of a quota. If you have 2 women, they think, oh gosh, are they going to fight? Is there going to be a cat fight? And only when you have 3 do people think, I don't really care, that this person's a woman. Are they adding value or not? And we get reviewed every year. There are annual reviews, 360. So we review each other. Management reviews us. You do not want to be on any board that has you there because they're box ticking for an annual report. It will show up in your review when your colleagues say you don't add value. And that is the most demeaning place, at least in my mind, that any talented person would find themselves. So there's a lot there, but I think we should have more confidence in what we bring to the table. We are talented, hardworking, smart people who have navigated enormous challenges. We can do better. We can add value. And yes, we happen to come in the packaging that we come in, but that to me should be the least interesting thing about us, and it's a nice to have. But I don't think we should be leading with that, and not because I'm ashamed at all. As I said to you, I think we should wear it as a badge of honor, but understand the complexities of being in a boardroom and what is really needed.
So once you're in that boardroom and you are, it is the nice to have, right? Your race and your gender. Has the culture of that boardroom evolved to the point that it really is an inclusive environment for those who are different?
So, it's that your question is a great question, but it's very hard for me to answer that, because what you need is some kind of a sort of different scenario, a world where I would know what it looked like if I wasn't in the board meeting. I mean, the truth is, I don't know. I can tell you that I have become, and I think this is part of my own education, I have become less sort of dogmatic and ideological about a whole host of things, not necessarily about race, but even agendas. How should we invest? How should we think about things? Because there's that humility that comes into understanding that complicated problems can really affect the life of many other people. But the other thing is that we shouldn't lose sight. And I know there are people, I'm sure, on this call who will say we don't need to feel sorry for a white guy. But, think about if the average board member that I serve with, who is probably in his mid-late 60s, maybe 70s. He grew up in a very, very different environment, like it or not. Some of them grew up in a very difficult Southern, racially diverse, or racially segregated environment. All of a sudden, I show up and I'm sitting next to them. I've had to learn in my own experience that they are also going through an enormous journey that nobody wants to talk about. For them, we obviously can make judgments that was a bad, horrible place, and they probably do too. But we don't really ask them, well, what is it like? Like, you grew up in an era where people said blacks and women were essentially nothing. And all of a sudden, here you are sitting in a boardroom with somebody sitting next to you who is exactly the person you didn't think was a human, and is your peer. And for me, again, I've gotten a lot of humility and a lot of education by hearing people say, hey, I grew up in Mississippi in the 60s and in the 50s, and gosh, I never thought that this was going to be my world. And so are there issues of inclusion? I'm sure there are. People don't just switch off. We're human beings ultimately. And I do think that I know some people will take a view. It's not my job to tell them, about my hair or what I do on my weekends with my family. That might be your attitude. But for me, I take all of this as a learning experience, but also a teachable moment for people who are earnest, but they just have a very different background. And we're in a world where people are very intolerant of that kind of a view. But the truth of the matter is, again, not just on racial issues, in general, the issues that boards deal with, digitization, worker advocacy, climate change, all of these are very complicated issues where having an ideological, dogmatic view, I think, makes it much more complicated to be part of a team. So I don't know if that helps answer the question. It's making it more difficult, but it's not meant to be a sort of woe is me. It's much more of if you show up with your you can back up the reason you're there, and we can, because many of us are talented, smart, educated, we've got amazing experience. You're never going to be worried about people thinking you're there for the wrong reasons.
Well, and I totally agree with you, Dambisa. At Take Your Seat, we believe in this idea of shared collaborative experiences. We believe that it's in the telling of our individual stories that we create a shared value system, empathy, which contributes to that feeling of inclusion and the consensus that's necessary in a boardroom. So I'm glad to hear you speak about that.
Yeah, and listen, I'm not claiming it's easy. I myself walk into boardrooms, and I have over the past 10 years. It's no fun walking, and people will know, it's no fun walking into the boardroom when you're the only Black woman. And they say, well, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and you're the only one in the ladies' room. And they're having conversations at the urinals in the men's stall about, who to hire or capital allocate. You're not part of that conversation. So obviously, I'm very much attuned to those risks, but I think we ought to be optimistic. We can put a man on the moon. I think let's try and be a little bit more constructive about what is possible. And never before in my own career have I been more euphoric about what can be done. But we're only going to get there if, as you say, Jerusha, we're much more collaborative. We're aggressive, of course. We want that needle to be moved from the conversations from 10 years ago. But at the same time, we need to solve problems. We can't just load a long list of challenges and not be constructive about a way forward.
Yes, and as your best friend Melody Hobson says, we have to be color brave.
Absolutely.
We have to be open to difference.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about a different type of diversity. We have a question here from Dr. Deborah Ashton here in the audience. And she says, as we discuss CSR and ESG, is it time for boards to see the importance of having board members with D&I or DEI experience on the board?
So I talk about this in the book, as you know. One of the data shows that role actually has very high turnover in the management ranks. And there's probably a lot more work that needs to be done around this issue. But the truth of the matter is people who tend to take a diversity role, which traditionally is sat in the human resources department, they tend to leave at very, very, certainly the studies that I cite in the book, it actually doesn't lead to a C-suite career. It's tended not, and listen, let's put this in context. It's not been around since the 1600s. This is like just in the last several years, but the evidence is not very good for that. I think that, and in the book, I talk about what I think an ideal board member is. An ideal board member to me is what I describe as a T board member, somebody who has a depth of experience in a particular area that needs to drive change. So areas such as technology, for example, audits and accounting. But at the same time, that top bar of the T means that they've got enough breadth to address or deal with a whole range of complex issues that might not be in their wheelhouse. And so, pandemic, I knew nothing about pandemics, but and I'm in the boardroom for a very specific reason. I have a financial background, I have an emerging markets, a global macroeconomic background, but they still need enough smarts around the table to be able to deal with that area. The D&I, the reason, and without thinking long and hard about it, I think there are a number of issues that are, to my mind, are not, they're parts and parcel of how an organization operates. So something like D&I. And so in that respect, would I think about ascribing a board seat to that specific role? It just doesn't seem to me, without thinking again long and hard about it, it doesn't seem to me to be something that over time is going to be up for question or up for challenge. We're going to get there. We are. And so having that seat for something that is going, as I mentioned, going to be much more part of an integrated way of how we operate. It doesn't seem to me, and by that I mean everyone on the board cares and should care, and we're measuring it and we're paying salaries based on it. There's a lot of that already in there. It seems to me ascribing a board seat for someone who's specifically focused on D&I, the evidence is pretty weak that that's a good idea. And just by the way, for people who want to know, I talk about this in the book, it's actually true for technologists too. People always say, do you want a technologist on your board? And I actually wrote about this in a Harvard Business Review article. The evidence is pretty weak because what ends up happening is you have somebody who really knows a lot about technology in the here and now. But guess what? A year from now, the parameters have changed. There's a new technology, and and not always, but very often, they don't have that broader lens. They're very good technologists, but they can't deal with the broader suite of issues. So I think those are the things that I would consider as I think about D&I. But I think it's a good question.
So another question that's come in from Dr. Kirk Beatty, he asks, while skills will get you the seat, the network is so important and needs to be considered. Can you speak to the importance of being intentional with one's network, not only for the board seeker, but also for the current board directors, to ensure that all the necessary board talent is available and considered for sitting directors?
Critical, crucial. I mean, without I'm myself, especially somebody who's we talked about, an unconventional board member, I would have been nowhere if I hadn't really, dug my well, so to speak, before drawing water out of it. I spent a lot of time building my network. It's extremely difficult, but in some respects, it's extremely easy, because there are, especially in a place like the United States, there's so many watering holes, from the Rotary Club to museums. And obviously, many people are alumni of different universities. This is exactly where these groups come from. The truth of the matter is that in all the boards that I've served on a number of boards in my over 10 years. Only on one occasion did a headhunter call me, and it was only to vet me. Every other time has come through my network. And so being intentional about building your network is absolutely critical. There are many portals and opportunities now. So, for example, the Financial Times has a non-executive director program. I think there are a lot of places where you can network. I'm very mindful that, especially for women, women with families, there is that tension of, you're having a drinks party at 6 o'clock in the evening. I need to pick up my kids and get them home and cook, and that responsibility still predominantly falls on women. And so there are challenges, no doubt about it. But, beyond that, the accounting firms that we use, the law firms that companies use, those are great portals. Because very often, if you're working with a PwC or KPMG or Deloitte or whomever, they are also advising other companies, often in their boardrooms, but also their management teams. So yeah, there's no doubt about it, being intentional, going to those watering holes, but also, as I said, thinking about professional services that you interact with, whether it's lawyers, accountants, etc., financial advisors, because they do very often have a sense about what issues the companies are dealing with and where you can actually add value, and also how they can get you your name in the fray.
That's great advice, because I don't think that we often think of our professional networks in that way, especially the service providers, who, you're right, they are linked into the company.
Absolutely.
And they're the ones speaking most often, right, with the CEOs, with the C-suite, to resolve a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I'll tell you, when I first joined one of the US boards, the lead independent director said, "How come I don't know you?" And he said, "I know all the headhunters, I know all the search firms. How come I don't know you?" And this is after sort of 9-10 years of serving on boards. I'd already been the chairman of a risk committee of a company that, as you mentioned earlier in the opening, we sold for $100 billion. This is SAB Miller. And I realized that the headhunters only put names of people who come from the C-suite. So if you are just, if you were like me and you weren't in the C-suite, but you wanted to be on boards, and you were spending all your time courting and catering to headhunters, they never told me. They never said, "Oh, by the way, Dambisa, you got no chance in hell because you are a non-conventional board member." They never told me, but that's actually what the reason was. He only saw people who were in the C-suite, and so you have to find other ways, and there are other ways, thankfully. As I said, the professional services are way overlooked. They are a no-brainer. They know more about these companies than the headhunters very often. So,
no, that's an excellent point. And it is one of the reasons that we created Take Your Seat, is to close that networking gap between the board leaders, the nominating committees, the CEOs, and the Black candidates who are seeking to be of service in the boardroom. Mm-hmm. So excellent. So now, as luck would have it, Millie Gilbert, one of our Take Your Seat members, has a question for you. She says, "It seems uncommon for leaders with backgrounds in economics and finance to be embraced in board leadership. I hear that companies tend to prefer industry operating experience. What perspective can you share on building this bridge from your professional background?" And Neely heads one of the largest international nonprofits. and has a wealth of economic experience in her background. So I'm sure that's why that question is very dear to her.
Yeah, look, I think that, I've said this a number of times, I think that the experience from the non-for-profit sector, going back to how do you network, has been so undervalued, and that's changing. And it's changing largely because the world is becoming much more ethical and moral about how we judge our leaders. In the book, in my book, How Boards Work, I talk about the fact that there are 400 people who lost their jobs, CEOs and business leaders, because of Me Too, and in just 18 months. And so I think that because the world is becoming more moral, the aperture is widening even more to bring people who've got sort of unconventional backgrounds. I value tremendously, and I was actually on a panel with Jim Collins, who wrote From Good to Great, who I think is phenomenal. His work is really great. But he asked the audience, what's harder to run, a for-profit organization or a not-for-profit organization? And there was absolutely 99% consensus, absolutely not-for-profit. You're dealing with multiple interests, which we're dealing with now with ESG, very complex environment. I think that unfortunately, and I've served on a number of NGOs and civic society boards, I think unfortunately there's this sort of sense that, oh, if you're doing that, it's not relevant. I think it's again about packaging yourself to say it's totally relevant. I've still had to devise strategy. We still had to hire and fire people, and we had to set a culture. Those are the three areas that corporate boards are focused on, and I know that civic society organizations are focused on that as well. So it's about that marriage. It's bringing that narrative when you're interviewing, saying, oh, absolutely, I can add value. In fact, you're dealing with ESG, you're going to have competing interests. It's no longer about financial shareholder primacy. It's about a whole range of stakeholders. Let me tell you how working with a range of stakeholders is difficult, but can be overcome. That, to me, I would sit up and listen. And I know a lot of board members, given the world that we're living in and moving into, are very interested in that. So in no way at all, and just going back to the more specific point about economists and macro, it's the same thing. To me, I'm like, we've only had liberal democracy and market capitalism for 1% of human history. Guess what? China is rising. Geopolitics are breaking down. Look what's happening to trade. Look what's happening to the government role. It's becoming more important. These are massive drivers for the global economy. The being able to narrate and to package that and say, how can you not think this is important for a board member to opine on? I think is to me, I think that's a very big opening for packaging that narrative. It's so obvious to me, and hopefully to others.
And now it is. Dambisa, thank you so much for packaging that narrative specifically. We get that question a lot, and that was brilliant.
Thank you.
Another one of our Take Your Seat community members, Kirk Holmes, has a question about digital transformation and cybersecurity risk. Are those candidate skills that combine IT, cybersecurity, and business management more useful now than they were ever before?
Yeah, absolutely, they are. And they permeate so many different areas. They permeate our strategy. How much capital allocation should you be driving towards cyber risk versus digitization? And I like that question because it picks up on exactly the point I made earlier. Don't just come and complain to me about cyber risk. I'll be tone deaf to that because I don't want problems. I want you to come to me and say, gosh, we've got cyber risk problems, but by the way, here's how we should spend that marginal dollar so we can drive better outcomes. We can be more in front of our customers, and we can better satiate community needs. So it's not just downside, it's also about upside leverage. And so that question, I think, is very well packaged. Again, to the point that I made, you can, and I talk about this in the book, that the role and the importance of digital obviously matters based on what kind of a company you are. If you are Google or Facebook, it's at the heart of the business that you run. Having knowledge on product or understanding, bits and bytes and coding, it will go a long way. In a utility company, maybe not so much. In a utility company, maybe the degrees of freedom of how you can enhance, digitization for something where you're essentially a monopoly could be quite different. And I talk about these different things in the book. One of my favorite examples, just to illustrate this point further, and has nothing to do with technology, but I think it's really important as you think about what boards you want to join. Think about something that Reed Hastings has talked about from Netflix. He's like, if you are making penicillin, you want very few degrees of freedom. So think about the vaccine. I want the same vaccine that Jerusha is getting. I don't want any differences. It should be exactly the same, even if you're making 10 billion vials of it. That's very different from a creative company like Netflix. They want as many degrees of freedom as possible. They want people to come in with the craziest ideas because they're throwing it on the wall and something's going to stick. And so you don't want to narrow people's creativity in that sense. So again, if you're thinking about digital and technology, think about the company that you're applying to. Do they really, really need technology as a way of differentiating their product or differentiating how they deliver their product? Or is it a nice to have and something that is useful, but it's not going to transform their sort of broader underlying widget or what it is that they're producing? So I think that's how I think about it. But I do like that tension again, the risk versus upside. Don't lose that perspective. Nobody likes naysayers, not in the boardroom. If you want a company to survive 360 years, you cannot just come with a list of problems. Nobody wants that.
Be solution oriented, right?
And by the way, as an economist, we tend to be downside. We spend a lot of time with policymakers. Everybody thinks to the downside. Oh my God, what if the vaccine doesn't work? What if there's another wave coming? What if there's a different, that's important, but business is going to move forward and society can't move forward with people who are naysayers.
So I want to ask, going back to your book, you identify several critical issues that boards of the future are going to face. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think that will give our audience of board service seekers a framework to think about their careers and how to be solutions oriented.
Yeah, at a very macro level, I think it's always important to stay plugged in. And I think the question earlier about being intentional with your network, it shouldn't stop when you become a board member. You're not dead. You might want to expand your relationships. You might want to join the trade associations where the company is a member. You might want to do more and understand how hedge funds or financial analysts are thinking about your industry. You might want to spend more time thinking about how regulators and public policies think about your industry. And it's really important to foster and pursue those interests, I think. And just to your question, I think that as sitting board members, there are a whole multitude of problems that some of them. The truth is, Jerusha, I don't even know what's going to happen in 6 months. 6 months ago, I didn't think voting rights was going to be an issue. Guess what? It's on the agenda now. I didn't expect that we were going to have COVID-19. Guess what? It came onto the agenda. So I can't tell you what's going to be important. I think there are some broad themes, things like deglobalization and the risk of a siloed world. I already mentioned here that we're becoming much more populist, much more fractured. You've had Brexit. You've had much more of America first, America, doing a lot of bilateral transactions, the sort of reincarnation of NAFTA into USMCA. You've got other regions doing the same thing, TPP, etc. So the world is more fractured. How do you run a global company in a world that's more fractured? We've been living for 50 years in a more global world. We were borrowing money in New York and London at low interest rates, and investing in Brazil and South Africa and generating high risk adjusted returns. What happens if there are capital controls or we're not allowed to invest any longer? It becomes harder to actually pay back dividends. It becomes harder to invest. We need to think about that. What about hiring? We've been enjoying being able to hire people from across the world, global talent pool. But look at the world, it's becoming so fragmented. Look at what's happening in the southern border of the United States, real issues around immigration. How, as a company, do you think about that? How do you think about trade? I'm on the board of 3M. We've been producing the masks. You saw there was one day we're walking along and didn't think anything of it. Next thing you got a deferred protection agreement by the government saying you can't export masks. We need them here first. How do you anticipate that? So globalization, those risks are absolutely alive. Digitization, technology, we talked about that. We're in a really ramping up phase with obviously the rise of China and their efforts in technology. Other areas that I talk about, short-termism. We've actually seen a reduction in the number of publicly traded companies over the past 10 years. We had 7,000 companies that were publicly traded. We're now down to 3,500. There's questions about whether people are feeling like they need to become more private. What does that mean for big institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, the large ones? Do they have more power? There's a lot of issues in the book that address these sort of big issues and trends that are occurring more and more.
Well, I just thought your discussion, especially of short-termism, was a very interesting idea because of that friction between planning, doing long-term strategy and having that short-term view. And I'm wondering if there's some interplay with those ideas for what's happening with diversity on the boards.
Well, there is that risk, and I obviously, just to be clear, I'm absolutely of the view that not only do I wish for more diversity, because I like to be around people who look like me as well as others, so that I can learn and I can grow for my own personal sort of improvement. But this is not up for debate. Everybody knows. It's like Geico ad. Everybody knows that. Everyone knows that diversity is good for a company. But I do think that we need to be careful about these Pyrrhic victories. So it's interesting. You raised this question about boards. Sometimes I worry a lot that we get so fixated about, we all want to be on publicly traded corporations. We're not seeing that companies are actually delisting and becoming private. Right. We're not thinking about what I call a Pyrrhic victory. It looks like we're winning, but actually, are we? And so there's discussions that need to be there. It's not just about putting a few people that look like us in the boardroom or in the C-suite or in peppering around in the organization. There are people from large retailers who will say, we've got a lot of diversity. But actually, when you look at the diversity they're talking about, it tends to be lower skilled, unskilled workers who are precisely the people who are likely to lose their jobs if digitization and robotics take hold. Who loses their jobs? But who's talking about that? So to your point about short-termism, today they look great because they've got a lot of people who are, at the till when you walk out of a supermarket, or they're the ones who are delivering your goods, and the truck drivers, Blacks and Latinos, and even women. But in 10 years' time, if you've got robotics, aren't they the ones who are going to lose their jobs? And if they do, what does that mean for all these metrics and the focus that we have today? So I think a lot about that tension of short-term versus long-term. And when we are trying to build businesses for the long term, I don't want any business that I'm involved with to fall while I'm involved, of course. But more than that, I hope sometime in the future, there'll be a board 300 years from now, 100 years from now, that will look back and say, wow, the board members in 2021 of our company made the right decisions in tough conditions with COVID, with issues around work from home, with issues around racial discrimination. They were on the right side so that the businesses can continue to survive, but also to thrive.
Yes, because I think we are both big supporters of long-term systemic change when it comes to board diversity.
Absolutely. And that requires, I'm afraid, education. We've got to stay in school, people. We have to invest in education. Education doesn't have an end point. It's about continual education. I like that question about being intentional. It's about putting ourselves in uncomfortable places where we are at this point minorities, but hopefully our children and our children's children will not be. It won't be so weird as it was for me 10 years ago. And we will also never have to be in a room where people think about us because of our race and our gender. They'll look at us and say that person is a great lawyer, a great economist, a great scientist, a great academician, accountant, etc. And they add tremendous value. Not because we look nice on the cover of the annual report, but because we actually are adding value, which we know we can add.
Because we are actually good board members.
Absolutely.
They recognize that. Well, right. Dambisa, this has been an incredible hour. The time flew by. I want to thank you so much for being with us here this afternoon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Jerusha, and thank you for everything that you do. I love the name of your company. And listen, let's not lose faith, people. Let's all be positive. Progress is being made. It's never as fast as we wanted to, but we've got momentum now. So I'm very optimistic.
May that day come, and may it come soon. And this has been a marvelous conversation. I have learned so much. I've been taking notes. Thank you to our viewers for watching from everywhere. Remember that you can purchase a copy of How Boards Work by just clicking on the button below the screen. If you haven't already, I encourage you to do so. And thank you both so much. Truly starstruck.
See you in the boardrooms.
See you in the boardrooms.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.